Good afternoon and welcome to Community Conversations, Disability Etiquette and Mental Health 101. Please welcome the Director of Faith-Based and Community Partnerships for the American Red Cross Los Angeles region, Jennifer Johnson.
Good afternoon. As my colleague John said, I'm Jennifer Johnson. I'm Director of Faith-Based and Community Programs at the Red Cross Los Angeles. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the hardships that the wildfires, the pandemic, and the racial reckoning in our country that has caused so many of us. I hold the intention that we all feel safe, peace, and joy. Uh, Although I work out of the Los Angeles region, I know that we have friends turning in from all over the country. That's been one of the highlights of the pandemic, is that by connecting virtually, we now have a much bigger neighborhood. So welcome and thank you guys for tuning in. And thank you to everybody, to our panelists and to even our Los Angeles neighbors for tuning in today and some of our repeat community conversation attendees. So welcome to Community Conversations, Disability Snapshot, and Mental Health 101. So how do we as humanitarians create safe spaces in both blue skies and in crisis? As allies, we recognize that although we may not be a member of a community with unique challenges, we want to open our minds so that we can know better and then we can do better. We want to make concerted efforts to better understand the struggles and unique challenges of communities outside of our own. As allies, we recognize our privilege and the power that that holds. We have the choice, and I feel the responsibility, to use our privilege to amplify voices beyond our own, to look around a room and say, who isn't here? Whose voice hasn't been counted? Community conversations are geared to support you as an ally and a humanitarian, and as I would say, a achieving person of compassion to alleviate human suffering. And each month, we try to highlight a different topic. We know that you are compassionate. You guys got that down. So our job is to help you turn that compassion into action. Our goal today is to make you the most well-informed humanitarian around. Maya Angelou said, when we know better, we do better. So today we wanted to highlight disability pride. There's been so much happening, over the years about advocating for people with disabilities. And sometimes it's easy to stay in our own bubble and to know sort of what affects us. 1 in 4 Americans live with a disability. My father, who was born without a disability, um, had ALS or Lou Gehrig syndrome. So that quickly took him from being a person who was able to move around very easily and very independent to someone who relied on us for care. And one of the most painful moments of my life is I had taken him to a doctor's office and we were in a part of town that had really good noodles. And so I said, let's go get some great noodles. And in going into the noodle shop, his power chair couldn't move through the door because it wasn't wide enough. And the shame and embarrassment that he felt, um, the hurt and anger that I felt, and that was just one moment, one time. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about disability pride, a snapshot into the history of advocating for people with disabilities, and what we can do to do better. So we also know that people struggle with mental and health challenges, and they often assume that sharing their story with friends and community imposes a burden on others, just like my dad did. My dad was so afraid to share what he was going through or rely on us. But in fact, the opposite is true. From a true ally's perspective, being entrusted with the care and burdens of another is a privilege. It's an opportunity to dispense generosity and a symbol and a sign of trust. And when both people share with each other more of their inner worlds, the more we can alleviate human suffering. The added bonus is that friendship is strengthened. And in the words of the proverb, friendship doubles our joy and divides our grief. Even though you are generous humanitarians, your time is still precious. So let's get started. Um, I wanted to introduce our panelists and then tell you too a little bit about the flow of the show. We are very grateful to Mariel Krazel and TJ Hill, who were from the Disability Community Resource Center, and Anat Habini, who is a Red Cross volunteer. She's been one for over 10 years, and she is an advocate and works to support disability integration within the Red Cross. I'm going to let them tell you a little bit more about themselves because their bios, they've all done so much. I did want to say, though, I really liked what Marielle's signature is, and it says a systems change advocate. And that's what I hope we can all be today and in moving forward. Just a little bit about the webinar. TJ and Marielle are gonna present. Then they'll kick it over to Anat. If you have any questions, like something comes up while they're talking that you're like, hey, I want to know more about that, just put it in the chat box. I'll be monitoring it, and then we'll have a Q&A section at the end of it. And then since you guys all registered for the webinar, thank you very much, we'll be following up with you with a link from the recorded version of the show that we'd love for you to share with friends, family, on your social media sites. And then also it'll have the resources that will be dropped into the chat box of where you can learn more. So I will turn it over to our friends from the Disability Community Resource Center.
Hi, I'm Marielle Kreisel. I'm a systems change advocate for Disability Community Resource Center. I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you so much for coming to hear our presentation and to engage in this topic. I'm a California native with a congenital spinal cord injury. I hold a bachelor's in honors English and worked as a paralegal in disability law practice from 2013 to 2017 on cases involving matters of disability discrimination. I'm currently a panelist on the Master Plan for Aging Equity Work Group and have been a commissioner on the Santa Monica Disabilities Commission since 2014. As an advocate, I elevate the quality of life for intersectional cross-disability people with disabilities and older adults through local, state, and policy development, legal advocacy, community organizing, and advocacy education. If we could start the slides, that would be, or TJ, did you want to go, or after?
Sure, I'll just introduce myself. Hello,
okay,
everyone. My name is TJ Hill. I'm the Executive Director of the Disability Community Resource Center. We're an independent living center located in Mar Vista and representing all of Western Los Angeles County. Independent living centers serve people with disabilities, primarily by people with disabilities, so we're a peer-led organization. That's very important. I myself am a person with a disability. I have multiple learning disabilities and also mental health disabilities. Before becoming the executive director here, I've worked 10 years prior as the mental health policy director at the Association of Community Human Service Agencies, where I represented the nonprofit mental health providers in LA County with the LA County Department of Mental Health. Before that, I worked at the Disability Rights Legal Center, where I served as the Director of Options Counseling and Legal Lawyer Referral Services, supervising and coordinating the agency's legal intake process. And then prior to that, I was a congressional legal intern for Senator Tom Harkin in Washington, D.C. He was a senator from Iowa and the father of the ADA. So while I worked in his office, I worked on special education policy, healthcare, and labor issues. I received my Juris Doctor law degree from Washington University School of Law in St. Louis and my Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from University of Arizona. Before that time, I worked as a habilitation specialist for adults with developmental disabilities and traumatic brain injury. And I currently serve on the Santa Monica Disabilities Commission as well.
Okay, well, let's get started with the slides. Today we're going to talk about various aspects of disability. Some of it's like Jennifer was saying, it's sort of a snapshot. It's not so much about an etiquette or a set of behaviors that we're going to talk about today. It's more about a snapshot and providing information about people with disabilities so that you can better understand who people with disabilities are and what it means to live with a disability. I'm just going to start with disability identity. From a disability studies framework, these are a series of questions that in disability studies would be explored. Disability studies really examines or challenges actually disability as an identity of defect, or you know, how people with disabilities are you know, consistently undermined by discrimination, and challenges that. And it just explores disability from a cultural, social, political, and economic point of view, and how people with disabilities define themselves and how they are defined. And one of those issues that have been studied is disability is the master trope of human disqualification. And I think disability study scholars since the 90s have really tried to define what that means and how it's socially constructed and how we can dismantle that. And they continue to ask questions. It's this ongoing exploration. What is disability identity? What is stigma? What is the significance of independence? And why is it important to be interdependent? As a person, as somebody who works at an independent living center, independence is an idea that I engage with on a daily basis, and the meaning of independence and freedom in the culture, and why it is important to be interdependent and not just isolated in your independence. And then intersectionality, the idea that different identities that are pathologized, like race and gender, could be added to disability to discriminate, rather than consider these variables as dimensions of a person's identity that enhance their personality and give them dimension. And that's really unfortunate. So we need to transform what it means to, instead of intersectionality being pathologized, we really need to think of it as an extension of a dimensionality of a person. And then also they have been exploring how are race and disability inextricably linked, and how all of these things inform disability pride. Next slide, please. So cultural models of disability, as I said before, disability studies explores how disability is defined culturally, politically, economically, and socially. And there are quite a lot of different models of disability, and these are really the top 3 that we see in the United States that really inform our thinking, thinking about how people with disabilities think about themselves and how people view them. The first one is the charity model. The charity model is really historic. It could be defined as victims of tragic circumstances to pity because they are suffering and are a burden, mediated by social services. And so the social services would be defined as assistance designed to preserve a dependent relationship. Let's go back. There we are. So that one's a really historic one, and one that people with disabilities have really worked hard to overcome. And that's really describes, right, it's connected to an economic understanding of how people with disabilities interact in the world of the workplace and employment. And it's really damaging. The medical model, that's also a very ubiquitous way to think about people with disabilities. It's a presumption of defect identified as an aspect of the person that diminishes their human value, to be mediated by medical professionals with cure and rehabilitation, right? The idea is that you must be fixed because your problem is internal. But it's not. It's socially constructed, and that's what the next model is: social construction theory. Social construction theory is embedded in the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we'll talk about in a moment. And it was developed in reaction to the medical model. Disability is socially constructed to include, in this model, disability is socially constructed to exclude people, oppress them, and prevent them from assuming control of their own lives. And this manifests as discrimination based on disability in employment, housing, transportation, education, really the range of activities that we engage in. And it's mediated by civil rights law, including the ADA, which is a non-discrimination and accommodations statute that seeks to level the playing field in a lot of ways. Social construction theory, however, it fails to acknowledge healthcare as an essential aspect of discrimination. Next slide, please. And so disability pride, so we talked about just a really brief snapshot of cultural models, and each of those actually could be like a whole webinar in and of itself. But that gives you kind of a way to think about the framework and a lot of the representations of what it means to live with a disability that are out there and are commonly accepted in our society today. What is disability and pride, and how does that impact those cultural models? Well, disability pride is accepting and honoring each person's uniqueness and seeing it as a natural and beautiful part of human diversity, right? So it would be the thinking would be disability is a natural part of the human experience, and everyone will have a disability at some point in their lives, right? 1 in 4 people with disabilities, 1 in 4 people in America has a disability at some point and right now. And so it's part of our lives, and it's unfortunate that it's pathologized because it's so ubiquitous. And I think that 2 aspects of disability pride are really, are huge components: self-respect and acknowledgement of human value. And self-respect, I found these really 2 great quotes by writer Joan Didion. The willingness to accept responsibility for one's own life is the source from which self-respect springs. And to free us from the expectations of others, to give us back ourselves, there lies the great singular power of self-respect. And when I read those quotes, I just think about choice, right? We have the opportunity, we're presented with that opportunity as people with disabilities to have choice of how we're going to respond to that and how we navigate in the world. And so that's really important, to acknowledge that we have choice. And also human value. Human value is a really significant thing in disability rights, and it's contested. It's been contested for as long as there's been disability, right? There's that element to it, and we've seen that with COVID, with medical rationing. We see that in genetic engineering. We see that in prenatal testing. That those are all challenges to human value, and disability pride, basically challenges that and says, be proud of who you are. Next slide. And so all of that to say, this would be the etiquette part, the etiquette portion of the webinar. People first language is really important. And so we've been talking about cultural models and how those are very undermining representations. And we've also talked about how the disability pride really is a self-respect, and how people with disabilities represent themselves without shame. And I think that disowning that shame or pushing back that shame is very much how we talk about ourselves, and how we are referred to is really important in deconstructing that shame. And so we'd like to be referred to as people first rather than our disability first. And so how would that look? Well, for example, a person with an intellectual or cognitive developmental disability. That's how one would be referred to, rather than someone who is retarded or mentally defective, which is a shaming and undermining way to think of them, and really reflects the values of the speaker. It doesn't reflect the values of the person they're referring to. A person who is blind, low vision, a person who has a visual impairment rather than the blind, a person with a disability, rather than referring to us as the disabled or handicapped or handicapable or special needs. Also, a person who is deaf with a capital D, because deaf culture is real, rather than referring to the deaf or deaf and dumb. Those are very antiquated and retrograde ways of thinking about deaf culture and deaf identity. A person who is hard of hearing, rather than someone who suffers from hearing loss. We don't think of ourselves as suffering, really. And a person who has multiple sclerosis rather than afflicted by MS. I've seen a lot of journalism that has referred to people with disabilities as being afflicted or confined to a wheelchair. People with disabilities don't think that way. We don't think of ourselves as being afflicted. Person with cerebral palsy, a CP victim, spastic. Again, people with disabilities don't think of themselves as victims. A person with epilepsy rather than an epileptic. A person who uses a wheelchair rather than someone who's, again, wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. These are, assistive technology is really freeing. It's about helping the person live in the environment rather than being confined by that. Assistive technology is very freeing. And then a person with muscular dystrophy is somebody who's stricken by it. Again, this is very antiquated, retrograde, and again reflects the person, not the person who's being identified that way, but the values of the person who's speaking it. Again, I've seen also too, person with a physical disability, that's valid, but being referred to as crippled, lame, and deformed, again, that reflects a very retrograde way to think about someone with human value. And then also a person who is unable to speak, as a person who uses synthetic speech or a speech board, it's valid. Rather than referring to someone as a dumb or mute or nonverbal. A person with a psychiatric disability, a person with a mental illness, rather than, referring to someone as crazy or nuts or psycho or mentally ill or messed up. And we hear this, right? It's ubiquitous in our culture to refer to people that way, but it's unhelpful and it misconstrues who they are. A person who is successful, productive, a role model, sometimes gets referred to as has overcome their disability, is courageous, amazing, and inspiration because of their disability. And I think that one's really tricky to someone who's that's not their experience. That could be, they could think that that's true because that's not their experience. Disability is very subjective, and every person with a disability has a different experience from a person with a different disability. I mean, it's just there's such a range. And so, but it could be your experience eventually as well. And so it's really, I think, there's different ways that we need to think about productivity and who is a role model. And, I think that thinking of how we think really is important, and how we identify people is really essential to creating a community that is respectful and that honors the value of everyone. And also the final one would be a person who is in recovery from a substance abuse disorder, rather than an addict or a junkie. Again, referring to someone in that way just isn't helpful. Can you, next slide, please. And then ableist phrases. Again, this would be again, a reflection of how we think. This is just simply a list of phrases I've heard over the course of my life, and also people that I know with disabilities that are different from mine who have been referred to by people in this way. You're so inspirational. What happened to you? What's wrong with you? Confined to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound. You need to be cured, or you should look for a cure. You're not normal. You are a fire hazard. I've heard that one. Do you work? These are very invasive questions and very condemning phrases. That's why they're ableist. Who is your caregiver? I don't think of you as disabled, which just denies and invalidates someone's disability. How do you get dressed? Very invasive. You don't look blind or disabled. How does someone who's blind or disabled supposed to look? I don't know what I would do if I were disabled. There's like a range of others, but those are the ones that I've seen in my life that continue to appall me and amaze me, that are still in people's thinking. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was the disability studies portion of the webinar, and I apologize that it's just so abbreviated. I know that there's so much there to unpack and to think about and to consider. This part of the webinar is more about a disability legal studies point of view, and how the laws, starting with the federal law of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, really began to set people with disabilities on a path to freedom, and do things, do things legally that had never been seen before. Can you advance the slides, please? So the Americans with Disabilities Act, that definition of disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of such an individual. And there's other components to it as well. The person would need to have a record of such an impairment or regarded as having such an impairment. So that's, it really broadens and includes quite a broad array of disabilities. And it was actually amended in 2008 to reflect that there's quite a range of disability, and a lot of it is subjective. Major life activities would include, but are not limited to, caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, focusing, thinking, communicating, and working. And the operation of a major bodily function, including but not limited to functions of the immune system, normal cell growth, digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. Next slide, please. And there are several titles. I'm going to go through just briefly the first three titles. Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act involves employment, and it protects qualified individuals with disabilities who, with or without reasonable accommodation, can perform the essential functions of the job. And it would apply to job application procedures, hiring, termination, training, pay, promotion, benefits, and leaves of absence. Next slide, please. And it would involve components of reasonable accommodation and undue hardship. What is reasonable accommodation? Well, it's reasonable accommodation would need to be readily accessible and usable by people with disabilities. And examples of that would be a job restructuring, a modified work schedule, a reassignment to an open position, an acquisition or modification of equipment, appropriate adjustment or modifications of exams, training, or policies, provision of qualified interpreters and other similar accommodations. And employment Title I would be enforced by the EEOC. And undue hardship, that would be an action requiring significant difficulty or expense when considering the nature and cost of the accommodation and the overall financial resources of the facility involved in providing the reasonable accommodation. And there's much, much more of that, but that's just a really simplified snapshot of how that works. Next slide, please. And then Title II involves state and local government entities. It's the subtitle A protects qualified individuals with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of disability in services, programs, and activities provided by state and local government agencies. And it extends the prohibition on discrimination established by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Next slide, please. And then Title III applies to public accommodations and facilities. And it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in the activities of places of public accommodations in restaurants, movie theaters, schools, daycare facilities, recreation facilities, medical facilities, shelters, and that's not an exhaustive list. Next slide, please. And sorry, that was so abbreviated, but that should give you a snapshot of some of the freedoms that were provided, that are provided by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the Olmstead Decision is case law supporting the ADA. And in 1999, the United States Supreme Court held in Olmstead that unjustified segregation of people with disabilities constitutes discrimination in violation of Title II of the ADA. And they held that people with disabilities have a qualified right to receive state-funded supports and services in the community rather than in institutions. And that's really important, particularly when you consider COVID is really impacting people who live in congregate settings, and quite a lot of the deaths involve people who live in congregate settings. So living in the community is really essential and it's important. The holding reflected two judgments. The first one was that institutional placement of people who can handle and benefit from community settings perpetuates unwarranted assumptions that people who are so isolated are incapable or unworthy of participating in community life. So it debunked that. And then secondly, confinement in an institution severely diminishes the everyday life activities of individuals, including family relations, social connections, work opportunities, economic independence, educational advancement, and cultural enrichment. And we are still needing to enforce that decision. That's really important. Next slide, please. And finally, just to give you a little bit of the history of disability, there was a really great timeline I wanted to share, but it's too extensive, about the different accomplishments over like the last 200 years that people with disabilities have done in the area of law and just advancing socially. But this is just really one issue that's really been kind of in my thoughts during this time. It's eugenics. And I didn't realize until recently that in California, eugenics is really historically horrifying. So I just want to share it really briefly with you. So what is the definition of eugenics? English statistician Francis Galton developed the word eugenics in 1883 to describe improving the qualities of the human population by discouraging reproduction of people with presumed genetic defects or inheritable undesirable traits. This would be referred to as negative eugenics, through methods like sterilization, or encouraging reproductions of people presumed to have inheritable desirable traits like intelligence or height. That would be considered positive eugenics. Negative eugenics also involves the identification of intersectional, socially constructed, moral, physical, or mental defects targeted for erasure. And in California, Eugenics began on April 26, 1909, with the first of a series of sterilization laws, making forced sterilization legal. And some of you may be aware of this. Over 20,108 people were sterilized without their consent from 1909 until 1963 in 12 state homes, excuse me, and mental hospitals. And under these laws enforcing the elimination of inheritable, socially constructed, and ableist moral, physical, or mental inferiorities. State hospital patients, institutionalized people with physical, developmental, intellectual, and psychiatric disabilities, and prison inmates were targeted with this reproductive injustice. Race, ethnicity, and gender were also factors, as women and girls were 14% more likely to be sterilized than men and boys, and male Latino patients were 23% more likely to be sterilized than non-Latino male patients, and female Latina patients were 59% more likely to be sterilized than non-Latina female patients. California was responsible for 1/3 of sterilizations in the US prior to 1964, right? That's within a lot of our lifetimes. Over half a century of sterilization in California ended in 1979, which wasn't very long ago, when eugenics laws were repealed. And in 2003, Governor Gray Davis apologized to victims of sterilization on behalf of the state. As recently as 2014, the legal sterilization of female inmates without consent in California ended when Senate Bill number 1135 was signed into law. And in 2018, the Eugenics Sterilization Compensation Board, administered by the California Victims Compensation Board, was created for survivors of sterilization conducted in California pursuant to these eugenics laws that were enforced from 1909 to 1979. And eugenics, and that's not all. I mean, it didn't end with 1979, actually. It continues to live on under the guise of medical rationing, genetic engineering, prenatal testing, and reproductive choice, furthering a false and dangerous debate about human value by questioning the quality of life for people with disabilities. And I think that's really where we are right now. We're in kind of a crucial time with a lot of the layered crises that are happening right now with the wildfires up north, with COVID, with racial inequality, where we're seeing that these issues of human value are really coming out into the open. And so I just really appreciate your attention, and thank you so much for listening to this presentation. TJ.
All right, let's move to the next slide. So that was a really wonderful history. Thank you, Marielle. So I like this quote, from the early Virginia Slims ads, if anyone remembers those, that, we've come a long way, baby. But the truth is we have a long way to go as the disability community. So we continue to fight, and we consider our fight as part of the civil rights movement. I love this banner here. These are some of the early pioneers of the ADA. At a protest march with the Martin Luther King Jr. quote of "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." That can't ring more true than it did then than it does today. So next slide, please. All right, so one of the areas of disability that a lot of people don't think about is sort of the expanded definition of disability. And we include in that mental health and psychiatric disabilities. So at our center, we support people with a whole range of disabilities to achieve their independence, and that includes mental health and psychiatric disabilities. A mental health disorder, also called a mental illness or psychiatric disability, is a behavioral or mental pattern that causes distress or impairment of personal functioning. Such features may be persistent, relapsing, and remitting, or occur as a single episode. Next slide, please. So common myths about mental illness. The first myth is mentally ill people are violent. This is probably the most destructive and commonly held belief among the society. The risk of violence is only slightly, if at all, increased by mental illness alone. The statistics on this actually are so, they're so layered and show really no correlation between mental illness and violence, that they don't even fall within the statistical margin of error. The truth is that people with mental illness are far more likely to self-injure, self-harm, or commit suicide. And that's the reality of this disability, unfortunately, for way too many people in this country. And so this is perhaps one of the most destructive and stigmatizing myths that's out there. Myth 2, mental illness is a character flaw that people can grow out of. So mental illness are brain disorders with well-documented biological dysfunction. Treatment and recovery can be, and often is, a lifelong process. So, this isn't something where we think of mental illness as like, the person's just going through a hard time and, they're going to get over it. Again, this kind of goes to our overall sort of thinking about disability and construct of disability, and then putting that on mental illness or psychiatric disabilities. Next slide, please. Myth 3, people with mental illness are incapable of making rational decisions. This is a big one. So mental illness impacts people to different degrees and at different times. It's impossible to think of mental illness just like any other disability. It's important to think of mental illness just like any other disability, with its own permeations of disability and functioning over time, which may require accommodations to provide equal access and promote independence. So oftentimes this happens particularly around folks who have different types of mental illness or psychiatric disabilities, where family members will step in and try to become the decision makers. Oftentimes they're removing people's legal rights to make decisions, including the legal right to vote. That's a very common one. And that still continues actively today. You can go down to the mental health court and see the incompetency hearings happening on a daily basis here in California and in Los Angeles. Myth 4, people on psychiatric medication become zombies. So much of the stigma about mental illness comes from a dark history of forced hospitalization, over-medication, and treatment with injuring effects. Newer treatments are relatively safe, non-addictive, and effective. One of the things we'll talk about are sort of the injury of from some medications that have occurred, and those are often present in a lot of the folks that we see who are our unhoused neighbors in the community. Next slide, please. So the human brain. So the human brain is the most complex organ in the body. Different areas of the brain control different things, such as the brainstem, we know, controls critical life functions, such as your heart rate, breathing, sleeping, those critical things that keep us alive. Your limbic system is the reward circuit, its ability to feel pleasure, perception of emotions, motivation, etc. That's the one that gives us those sweet cravings for certain foods and makes us, those of us that love chocolate and don't love chocolate, it's all related to your limbic system. The cerebral cortex is the sensory processing. That's where we are thinking, planning, solving, problem solving, and making decisions. Next slide, please. So here we go. This is the diagram of the human brain. So as you can see, it is definitely a complex organ. All of these different sections represented in different colors represent different areas and functioning of the brain, which is also known as the cerebral cortex. So these are some of the areas that we have been able to identify through neuroscience. But this is all to say is this, if you talk to people that have been working in neuroscience, we have gone through leaps and bounds in terms of the knowledge that we've gained. And the best quote that I have from somebody on this is, they described it as exploring the ocean. And they said, well, if our understanding of the brain is probably at the level of understanding the coral reef and its relationship to the entire ocean, and that we still have the entire ocean to explore. So while we do understand a lot, there's still a lot to have to learn. Next slide, please. So what is mental illness? Mental illness or mental disorder is a diagnosable condition that affects a person's thinking, emotional state, and behavior. It disrupts the person's ability to work, carry out daily activities, engage in satisfying relationships. So as you can see, having a mental illness or a mental disorder would fall under the legal definition of having a disability, right? Because it would affect one of those major life activities, which would be work or carrying out your daily life activities or engaging in satisfying relationships. Those are all things that are covered under the ADA. Next slide, please. So the way we categorize mental illness and mental disorders in the United States is the use of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM. So the DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it offers a common language and standard criteria for the classification of mental disorders. So you would think this is a really good thing, but it has been used and relied upon by clinicians and researchers, psychiatric drug regulation agencies, health insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, the legal system, and policymakers. So what is missing in that list, if you look at that as who relies on it, are the individuals affected by the mental illness, right? So it is a very medical model based assumption and sort of construct of disability, but it does come from, you know, the science community. The DSM is in its 5th edition, so we're in the DSM-5, which was published on May of 2013. The first edition was published in 1952. The DSM has received some praise for standardized psychiatric diagnosis grounded in empirical evidence, opposed to theory-bound nosology, but since the DSM-3, but it also has generated criticism and controversy. Related critiques include ongoing questions concerning the reliability and validity of many diagnoses. The use of arbitrary dividing lines between mental illness and normality, possible cultural bias, and medicalization of human distress. I think it's important to note that not very long ago, homosexuality was listed as a disorder in the DSM. There were disorders that were related to women's menstruation, which was called hysteria. Hysteria was actually a disorder that was only attributed to women, and we can just assume on the biases that were involved in constructing that, given that the early DSM was written all by men. Next slide, please. So the prevalence of mental illness. This is an important slide for people to sort of get an idea of what the range is, because I think that when people think about mental illness, there's an image that comes to mind. And it's sort of the inverse, I think, of what is actually the prevalence of disorders. So anxiety disorders represent 18.1% of adults in the United States. So that's the highest number. So a lot of folks have anxiety disorders. That's one of my disabilities. So I have anxiety disorder, very common, but that would be one of that would be the most common type of mental disorder. Major depressive disorder is the next one, but you can see that significantly drops to 6.7%. So again, when we hear a lot about discussions of mental illness, it's often been about people with depression sort of coming out of the closet and saying they have depression. And, you know, there's been first ladies and other folks who have well-known figures who have come out and talked about their depression, that still only represents 6.7% of mental disorders. So obviously, for such a small proportion, there's a lot of stigma still associated with that. Substance use disorders, that represents 3.8%. Bipolar disorder, 2.6%. Eating disorders, this one is probably underreported, but it's at 2.1%. There's been a lot more study, particularly in men and young boys, on the study of eating disorders. So we think that this is actually one of the disorders that has a lot of gender bias implicit in it, and it could actually be a little bit higher. Schizophrenia represents only 1.1%. So all of the mental disorders, in the United States, we have 26.2%. So roughly a quarter, a little more than a quarter of the population has some sort of mental illness. And I think that's important to think about. But when a lot of people think about mental illness, particularly with our unhoused folks, is we think of schizophrenia, right, as being just the most common. And while there is probably disproportionately represented in the unhoused population, it is by far one of the most infrequent mental illnesses. Next slide, please. Mood disorders. So these are just a quick overview of sort of what covers on these. Mood disorders, we have major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder 1 and bipolar disorder 2, dysthymia, postpartum depression, seasonal depression. Next slide. Psychotic disorders, we have type of disorders which psychosis occurs in is schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, schizophreniform disorder, delusional disorder, brief psychotic disorder, psychotic depression, and drug-induced psychosis. We'll talk a little bit more about the drug-induced psychosis and just the relationships of substances and substance use to mental illness. Next slide, please. So psychosis is a condition in which a person has lost some contact with reality. A person may have severe disturbances in thinking, emotion, and behavior. Usually occurs in episodes. It is not constant or a static condition. Psychotic disorders are not as common as depression and anxiety disorders. We talked about that in the first slide. Next slide, please. Anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders differ from normal stress and anxiety. That's sort of one of the big stigma hangups that people have, is not really understanding the difference of that, of like, oh, you just get nervous, or you're like, you have, you're like, and as a male being treated for anxiety disorders, I can say this is one of the ones where it's like, they're kind of like, well, you're having, stage fright or nerves or something like that, and not really understanding the full range of what actually is involved in the anxiety disorder. The anxiety disorder is more severe, lasts longer, and interferes with work, regular activities, and relationships. Anxiety can range in severity from mild uneasiness to a panic attack or a flashback. Often occurs with mood disorders and substance use. For those that don't know, my anxiety disorders were attached to those panic attacks. And for anyone who's ever had a panic attack, a real panic attack, they are terrifying. You really do not know what is going on with your body and your brain, because everything seems out of alignment at that time. And so that's why the anxiety disorders can be so disruptive to somebody's life. Next slide, please. Types of anxiety disorders. You have generalized anxiety disorder, which is persistent, overwhelming, unfounded anxiety or worried, accompanied by multiple physical and psychological symptoms. You have panic disorders, which which are reoccurring panic attacks and persistent worry about possibility of future attacks. Like I said, the experience of having a panic attack is so it's such a negative experience that the fear of having another one can be just as overwhelming as actually having the actual attack. Phobic disorders, these avoids or restrict activities due to fear of specific objects or situations. So we've heard about, people that are agoraphobic or, have fear of heights and planes and all those kind of things. Post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder, that's anxiety experiencing and distressing catastrophic event. And obsessive compulsive disorder, which is obsessive thoughts and behaviors accompanying an anxiety. Next slide, please. Personality disorders are inflexible and pervasive behavioral patterns which often cause serious personal and social difficulties. 10 different subtypes. So you have cluster A, which are schizoid, schizotypical, and paranoid. Cluster B, which is borderline, narcissistic, antisocial, and histrionic. That's the one we hear about a lot in the news. And then cluster C is obsessive compulsive, dependent, and avoidant. Next slide, please. Differential diagnosis. So this is something which is important to sort of talk about. Not every symptom of mental illness is caused by an actual mental illness. And that's sort of hard to sort of wrap your head around, but to think about it like this, mental illness symptoms often overlap with each other. So it's important for folks, for medical professionals in particular, to rule out medical conditions. So for instance, when I first went to the hospital for my panic attack, they had to run diagnosis to make sure that I didn't have a brain tumor or some sort of other, physical dysfunction that was happening in my brain, just to rule those things out. They also asked me, had I been using any drugs or alcohol when I came in, because that can have an interplay oftentimes and show some of that differential diagnosis. And then they asked me if I was on any medications and try to rule out if there's any interplay there. Next slide, please. Addiction and mental illness. So this is important to note that they coexist commonly. Mental illness may precede an addiction. Drug use and abuse may trigger or worsen mental illness in vulnerable individuals. And this is what we, again, tend to see in our unhoused population. Next slide, please. So treatment of mental illness, you have types of professionals. You have psychiatrists, doctors, psychologists, social workers, counselors, other mental health professionals, certified peer specialists. We have types of professional help, psychotherapy, medication, psychoeducation, alcohol or other drug treatment, other professional supports. And then finally, we have self-help and other support groups, peer support groups, family support groups, family, friends, and faith, and other social networks. So interestingly, out of these types of treatment, the ones with the highest amount of success for people of ongoing treatment of mental illness is actually the third category of self-help and other support groups. And I think that is also something that is not commonly valued or thought about in the context of mental illness and treatment. Next slide. Recovery from mental illness. It's important to note that recovery is a process in which people are able to live, work, learn, and participate fully in their communities. For some, this is the ability to live a fulfilling and productive life with a disability. So I would fall into that group, right? For others, recovery implies the reduction or complete remission of symptoms. For some folks, they might, and this is particularly true in some of the depressive disorders, they might be more connected to a very difficult time in somebody's life. And once they sort of move through that time, they no longer have the symptoms, and they go into complete remission. And so that person will be recovered from episodic mental illness, but they'll never have, it wouldn't have still just gone away, right? That person still has a mental illness or a mental disorder. Next slide. So I want to talk really briefly about mental health first aid. So this is something that has been developing over the last really 10 years in the United States. So it's an acknowledgement that mental health problems are common. We know they're very common. And they're particularly common among those of us that work in the help industries, right? When we're helping and working in the community. There's a lot of stigma associated with mental health problems. Many people are not well informed about mental health problems. Professional help is not always on hand, and people often do not know how to respond. So people with mental health problems often do not seek help. So it's a sort of a vicious cycle. And so we want to try to break that cycle by having people that are well informed. And hopefully all of you today get a little bit of a snapshot of being more well informed on mental illness and how to address that. Next slide, please. So how to help. So easy ways, assess for risk of suicide or harm. Again, most common thing is that the person is going to be self-injurious. So you want to check to make sure the person is not a threat to themselves. Listen non-judgmentally, give reassurance and information, encourage appropriate professional help, encourage self-help and support strategies. Next slide, please. Communication techniques. So it's important to listen, reflect, validate, emphasize desire to be helpful. Do not try to talk a person out of their delusional beliefs. That never works. Do not validate the delusions at the same time. So if someone says, you know, I see somebody in the room with you and there's no one else in the room with you, don't say, oh yeah, I see that person too. That's not going to help diffuse the situation. Build a relationship. That's the most important. Help the person identify the crisis, and we'll talk about how to do that. Assess the person's usual mechanisms for coping with a crisis. That's talking about family or other friends, or you know what other kind of supports they have, and refer finally to appropriate treatment. Next slide, please. De-escalation techniques. So it's important in these tense situations to remain calm and avoid overreacting. One of my standout sort of memories of this is I was working at a disability law firm, and one of our clients had a major episode in the office, and one of our paralegals like literally put up her hands and was like, oh my gosh, and it was like the escalation of the event just got worse. And so it's really important to remain calm and avoid overreacting. Indicate a willingness to understand and help. So all of you that are in the helping world, I know that this is like something that comes really second nature to you, but you know, it's really important to think about it in the context of why it helps to de-escalate. Speak and move slowly. That's a big one. Be empathetic. Remove distractions, upsetting influences, or disrupted people from the scene. So oftentimes, you know, if there are two people having a conflict, good to get them separated. Or if someone's agitated by a certain person, get them separated. Pay attention to the person. Help the person save face and convey hope if possible. So that one, save face. So for those people who are experiencing a mental health episode, it is extremely, extremely embarrassing. It is a altered state of consciousness, right, that the person is in. And so you want to try to help them move through that in the least embarrassing sort of possible way, and try to maintain as much dignity for that person as possible, right? Respect personal space. Recognize that the person may be overwhelmed by sensations, thoughts, beliefs, voices. Be friendly, patient, accepting, encouraging, but remain firm and professional. And I think that's one that's sort of the balance, but we'll talk about that. Next slide, please. So words that help on this, you know, I want to help you. How can I help? This can be worked out, trying to be positive, right? This can be worked out if you will help. That's my favorite one, is, you know, try to create a partnership, a relationship with the person. I need your help. That's good, you know, be encouraging. I don't want anyone to get hurt. I know that you don't want to hurt anyone. That's also a really positive one to sort of to put out there, because again, there's so much stigma that people carry, and oftentimes they see the way people respond to them. And if they see frightened faces looking at them as they're in distress, they're more likely to think like, oh my gosh, they think I'm going to hurt people. So it's important to state that out loud to the person. Next slide, please. Things to avoid: moving suddenly, giving rapid orders or shouting, forcing a discussion. You don't want to do that. Maintaining direct, continuous eye contact. So that's the stare down. Don't stare someone down when they are having a psychiatric episode. Touching the person, avoid touching the person. We're pretty good about that now with COVID, but even sometimes people think like they'll put their arm on their shoulder or something that can be really distressing to somebody. So don't touch the person. Expressing anger, impatience, or irritation. Using sarcasm or making fun of the person, or making levity of the situation in general. Just avoid doing that. Crowding or cornering the person. Again, you want to try to give the person space, right, to feel like they are you're not trying to detain them in any way. Assume that the person who does not respond cannot hear. So that's the, people sometimes they're like, oh, they're not responding, so they get louder or try to say, the person is probably hearing you. It's just taking a little while for those messages to get to their brain. Lying, so don't lie. That's the biggest one. People with mental illness are not stupid, and they will remember what you said. So this is the biggest one when working with our unhoused population. Again, I think that a lot of people make the mistake of thinking, that if they tell them something and they coerce them into a situation to, in the hope of getting them some help and assistance, that's okay. It's not okay, and the person will remember that. And so oftentimes when we see people who are very service resistant in the unhoused population who have mental health issues, they will talk about, well, no, those people are a bunch of liars. They do nothing, they don't do anything for you there. And it's because they have experience with somebody that, lied to them. Using inflammatory language such as crazy, psycho, or mental, obviously those are no-nos. And then finally, challenging delusion or hallucinatory statements, and then don't validate them either. Next section, please. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. So recognizing psychiatric emergencies. So if there is a violence or violent threats are being made, that's a pretty easy one. Suicide attempts or suicidal threats, don't let those just go off on their own. Oftentimes, if somebody is saying, I want to kill myself or I'm going to hurt myself, don't just let them leave the situation, because I have a really horrible, disheartening story of, again, being a young associate at a law firm, and one of our clients said, and it was unrelated to any kind of mental health issue, but they were really distraught by the family litigation they were going through. And they said, I'm going to go and kill myself. And they left our office and they went to the parking garage and they jumped off the top of the parking garage right after they left our office. And they had said in our meeting that they were going to kill themselves. So when people say it, listen to them and take those threats seriously. Intoxication. So that is a psychiatric emergency. If somebody is so intoxicated and impaired that they are not making good judgment, they're likely to hurt themselves or be hurt, right? Abhorrent or disorganized behavior, wandering, rambling incoherently, nudity, repeated trespassing. Those are all things that indicate a psychiatric emergency. Next slide, please. Resolving psychiatric emergencies. So informal resolution is the best resolution. Most commonly utilized according to studies is, taking the person home. That's a great one, right? Obviously, seeing that they have someone there, but these are the most common and the most effective. Referral to outpatient services. This is going to be the warm handoff. So this is, you know, you have a connection and you've called that mental health provider and you say, I have, you know, Johnny or Susie here, and, you know, we would like to come in for an appointment, and then often helping the person get to that appointment. Conflict resolution, contacting family members, do that only with permission, but that's very helpful. So then the final two are the not preferred methods. Call the police for transport to a psychiatric emergency department or civil commitment. You have to be really clear with the police when you call them about a psychiatric emergency that you're just asking for a psychiatric transport. If you say, I have someone who is delusional and rambling and being self-injurious, the police will send their armed police. They're going to be armed anyway, but they're going to send people there to respond to a dangerous situation, and that can escalate. And then finally, often, you know, be very careful about calling the police for arrest. That should be a last resort of calling. Next slide, please. When to refer to ongoing mental health services. So if the symptoms are so severe that they require police or hospital intervention, that's important. Symptoms persist for 2 weeks or more with decrease in function. So this is folks that we see on a regular basis that we're, you know, providing service to, and we can see that there's really a decrease in their functioning. That's an appropriate time to suggest some mental health services. Or if the person is requesting help due to the symptoms. This is actually happens way too often, and just that professionals don't hear them. A person says, you know, I really wish I could talk to someone. That's like a red flag, like, yes, okay, let's get you talking to someone. But oftentimes people just, you know, sort of brush that off, and because the lack of availability of resources. Next page, please. So here are some easy referrals for ongoing mental health services. You have the LA County DMH. This is their line. It is 24/7. You can also text to them now, the text LA to 741-741. That's awesome. You can get someone from the line live right there, and they can help navigate crisis. LA County Helps is a newer website that's up, and that's a great resource for folks. Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So this is actually a LA-based lifeline that is a national lifeline, but it's based here in Los Angeles. You wouldn't know it if you call, because you can call 24/7, and it sounds the same whenever you call, but they're a great resource for folks. And then finally, the Los Angeles County Homeless Outreach Portal. This is a really useful resource that has become available in the last couple of years, particularly if you're building a relationship with somebody who you see on a regular basis in your community that you think needs some help. You can enter the information into the portal, and the county will send somebody from DMH, so a social worker, to make those contacts and start developing relationships to hopefully get the person into treatment. Next slide. And then here are some other resources: the National Institute on Mental Health, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, National Alliance on Mental Illness, and finally, Mental Health First Aid website. So that's all I have. I think the next slide is just some additional resources and references. Yep. And that's all we have.
Thank you, guys. I actually have some notes of some questions I have and some resources that I want to ask you guys to share that I think that we could share really widely. I did want to kick it over to Anat, and so that we can talk about how the Red Cross supports people with disabilities, and in her role in disability integration. So Anat, can you unmute yourself and turn on your camera and tell us a little bit about what the Red Cross is doing?
Hi, everybody. It was a great presentation on both of you. The Red Cross significantly realized that in time of, I'm going to talk about in time of disaster because I just want to, we are living in time of disaster. The pandemic is a disaster. We have fires everywhere. In California, we have hurricanes. And, you know, when I started doing disability integration, and I'm just going to tell you, I've been a volunteer for 3 years for the LA region doing disability integration. I've been deployed for 10 deployments since then, and 8 of them are as a disability integration lead for many areas, from Hawaii to South Carolina to Houston to Oklahoma to any kind of disaster. And I understand my role as trying to make sure that when we have a disaster and people coming to our shelter, that everybody is welcome, regardless what they have, race, any people with disability, anybody who has difficulty, English second language, anything, that they feel welcome. And what does that mean for us to feel welcome? The equity of services, that our shelters are accessible for everybody, that not just the physical shelter, but the ability to communicate, the making sure we have interpreter for anybody who needs that, make sure that our workforce in disaster really understand what it means self-determination for everybody. And this is important to me as a person to understand that we have to allow everybody self-determination, how they want to be. If they needed help, they would ask from you. So there's so many things to do as disability integration, and our population that we serve is really enormous. And you know, I'm a person with disability because without my glasses and my contact lenses, I would need somebody to read me anything so I can be able to understand. But I wanted to reiterate, because I want to do it quick to bring it home. Ridgecrest earthquake that happened here about a year ago. It was the first disaster that I was there the first day. And I really understood why we need to have disability integration, because the chaos, the sheer chaos in a shelter, people coming, the trauma they go through of leaving the house, no matter what people. On top of it, you have people with disabilities that come in to the unknown and have difficulty to find themselves in that whole chaos. And I know I've seen how difficult it is to get everybody. So I was so grateful to be able to be on the first day and make sure that our shelter are accessible and we have all the services and everybody there to accommodate everybody and everybody to feel welcome. I don't know, I think it will be great if people will have questions to me, so I can actually would help you with that. That is the Ridgecrest earthquake, actually holding a lot of what we call sensory kids. We had a big population of adult and children on a spectrum from Ridgecrest. And we try to provide some kind of comfort. There's a lot of people that has anxiety, and it exacerbates in time of disaster, and the sensory kits does help kind of ease the living in a big shelter with a lot of other people. All of them are very stressed. So we also work with the community, and this shows my work in the community, more rural area of Ridgecrest and Trona up there. We just made sure that people with disability do know that we have services and we can bring the community to them if they need it. And that was, that slides show part of what I did for the community. So when we talk about disability integration, we're there for our shelter clients and for our community clients as well. And I'm open to questions for all of you. I'm working with Blue Sky and trying to work with all our community partners to advocate, to coordinate and collaborate services that in time of disaster we can rely on each other and have and actually support each other in time of disaster. And I can't reiterate enough that we are always on the brink of some kind of disaster coming on. So the more we get educated about what the population that we serve in our shelter need and what we can be helped from our community, the more we can provide better services to everybody equally and in equity. So if there's any question, I'm right here to answer too.
Thank you, Anat. And we really appreciate you joining us today. For all of you guys that don't know, Anat is virtually deployed. So instead of being flown somewhere, she is doing disaster work from her home, which is sort of our new normal now. So thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for being here today. We did have some questions that came up, and it's funny, Chris Sanchez, who is one of our star volunteers, asked a question to you, Marielle, and it was funny, it came up for me too. She was asking about, we went over the unacceptable language, and I know you had a column where there was like sort of what was unacceptable and then kind of what to reposition it as, or I think it was the other way. Could you share that with me so that we can share that with all of our members so they can see that? I thought it was a really nice sort of cheat sheet. And, you know, all of it made so much sense, but I think sometimes we don't stop and think about that stuff. So thank you for sharing that. I know for you, it may have seemed like the obvious stuff, but there were things on there that I learned as well. And I think I'll do better too. And then TJ, the other thing I wanted to ask you for was you had a mental health services contact sheet. And then there was also one that had other resources. If we could have those two slides, I think those would be great to share. A question that I had is that I think that there just needs to be like a whole public service announcement is when we see someone in danger, because I think we're so aware now of what calling the police could escalate to, is letting people know who they can call instead. Is there an organization in Los Angeles that if you do see somebody who's struggling, that you could call instead of calling the police?
Yeah, so there's those two on the slide, and I actually clicked my slides away too. But the main one is the LADMH. So you're going to get somehow referred back to them. So, but we have a actually in LA County, we are the largest mental health system in the entire world. Here in Los Angeles. So there are a lot of resources, but I think that oftentimes people don't know how to access those resources. So you can go directly to the LA DMH line. And then finally, the other one that was more recently set up was for really looking at our unhoused folks, and that was that homeless services link. So it's a portal that the county has set up. I've used it several times. It is, you know, it's a great portal for, you know, those folks that you might see living in your neighborhood and that you see on a regular basis. You can start to create a profile on that person and, you know, create a relationship. You can talk to them and, you know, get to know sort of, you know, what's going on with them and if they are in distress or need or what their needs are. And then you put in the portal and you say, you know, I've talked to the person or I've not talked about it, but, you know, as much detail as you can put in about the person and sort of their regular schedule. And then the county will send the social workers, which are the homeless services social workers, out on that same schedule that you've put out. And so they'll try to make contact. And once they make contact, they develop a relationship, and those contacts can, you know, it can be a couple of weeks. It can also be over the course of a couple of months. But then we're able to move that person into some sort of supportive housing, which has all the wraparound mental health services incorporated with it. So, you know, that's really the best resource you can do, but it takes building those relationships. And so that's why the police are really ill-equipped to do that, right? Because the police, you're calling, you know, 911 and you're asking for police assistance. They don't know what the situation is. They only are getting what the 911 dispatcher is telling them, you know, and that's why you get these questions like, is the person armed? And you're like, no, I don't see any weapon. And they're like, there's no visible weapon, you know, that's what they'll put in. And so there's already sort of this automatic assumption that when you're calling the police that it's to resolve a violent situation. And that's oftentimes not the case in these psychiatric emergencies. So you want to try to find the most appropriate resource. And again, I always like to go with the least invasive, like the least invasive first. It's, use those community things, talk to the person and see, help them save face. Do they have a home? Do they have somebody that you can call? It's amazing how oftentimes just doing that can de-escalate the situation. I've been in that situation with folks and had people come back to me later and say, I thank you so much for intervening in that way, because if you had, called the police instead of calling my mom, I don't think I would have survived that situation. And it's simple de-escalation.
Thank you for that. I think that that's such a topical question right now, especially in Los Angeles. Okay, another question that came up is a couple of people asked for all of your slides, because I think they had so much information on them, and that's great because we have a lot of faith leaders and community leaders, so I feel like it'll really get amplified. So if you guys are comfortable sharing that, we can also share that with our guests. One of the other questions, and I had this feeling, or I had this happen to me too, and this is another one of our disaster employees. Carolyn asks, she lives in Inglewood, and she's saying that she's seeing businesses that are not in compliance with the ADA. Like, what should we do? Who monitors that? How can we kindly get them to adhere to, what they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah, so Mariel, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
You can take that one.
Okay, sure.
Our former attorney.
So ADA enforcement is one of sort of the interesting parts of the ADA too. It can be enforced both by the public sector, so by government. So you can go through, if it's a high up city kind of thing, you can make a complaint to the Federal Department of Justice. They have an ADA web page, and you can you can file a formal complaint that way. Now, in our current administration, the Civil Rights Division is not the bastion of civil rights that it used to be. So that might not be the best way, but then you can also do it locally. So the city is actually responsible for code enforcement. So they should, in the city of Inglewood, they should have a code enforcement section, and that somebody is able to make a complaint to. And then finally, the other way is there's under the ADA, one of the best parts of it is that there's a private right of action. And so people can, call disability advocacy organizations, law firms, and say, I've tried to talk to, most of the law firms will try to do this too, is that, to talk to the business first, if it's a business entity, and say, hey, like, you need to put a ramp on your front door, or widen your doorway or something like that. They'll and sort of give them the information to be able to do that. Very rarely, and I've been involved in this kind of litigation in the past, will you get a business owner who's like, no, we don't want people with disabilities here, which I have heard. And in that case, those are the entities that get sued, and then that's the corrective, right of action in that case. There's multiple ways to sort of address these. The thing is, ultimately, the cities are responsible for making these changes. The city of Los Angeles is still under a settlement agreement that is in effect now to try to make all of our crosswalks and sidewalks have curb cuts in them.
That was her question.
Probably seen lots of those over the years being added, but they're not. But those are only within the city of LA that settlement agreement applies to. So you have to look at the other cities. And as a commissioner on the city of Santa Monica's Disabilities Commission, I've worked with the city of Santa Monica to make sure that all new construction and all things. If you go to the city of Santa Monica, it's a lovely place to go. Most of the time, is that you see a lot of crosswalks, right, and curb cuts put in. That's through that sort of intentional advocacy. So to continue that advocacy in your communities, the cities do know that they're on notice to be able to do those things, and particularly when they're upgrading streets or places, that's where like is the best opportunity to get those things put in.
And also I would add, reaching out to an advocate like myself to negotiate that so that it can be settled, out of court. Hopefully that's really a good opportunity to learn negotiation skills and work with someone on that.
Thank you. And then this was a pretty focused question. It was talking about tinnitus, and the ringing in the ear is now being reported as an auditory problem, a processing pathway in the brain, not truly an ear problem. Does that make it a mental illness?
No, it does not make it a mental illness. So mental illness has to be defined under that DSM that we talked about earlier. So if it's not in the DSM and tinnitus is not in the DSM, tinnitus is a medical condition, and whether or not it's neurological or physical doesn't matter. It's still considered a disability, and it depends on how severe, obviously, the tinnitus is to affect one of those major life activities of the person. So, I've seen people with tinnitus that have such severe tinnitus that it affects their functioning, ability to stand and orientate in a space. It can be really debilitating. And I've also seen people with tinnitus that, it's just a slight ringing in the ear in the background. And it really doesn't affect their daily functions. So, but it would qualify as a disability, but it would not be a mental illness. It'd be a disability though.
Wonderful. And the last question is actually mine. And I have a son that has ADHD, and I refer to it as a learning difference. Do you feel like it should be a learning disability, or is that really personal choice? Or what would be some advice or guidance you would give me because he's looking to me to frame this for him. So
yeah,
what would you suggest?
So I always say, I'm a father of a young child as well. And so I like to sort of let our children lead us to sort of what they're comfortable in, but then positively affirm them. And, I think one of the things that we as parents tend to do is try to shelter our kids, right, from being, to feeling pain. And so oftentimes that same conversation kind of comes around the ideas of disability identity. And if we say things like, it's just a learning difference. Well, which I understand. Yeah, my other disabilities are learning disabilities. So I have ADHD and I have other reading processing disorders and things. So it took me a very long time to come to a positive self-identity about disability and to talk about my disabilities in a way that is reaffirming and that shows pride in that. And that took me an entire adult lifetime, because those messages that I initially heard were things like, you're a dummy, or you can't, you're not good at school, and when I mentor young kids and I try to tell them stuff, I'm like, that's what my teachers and stuff told me when I was young. My teachers, now hopefully I hope that teachers aren't doing that, and that as a society we're more positive and reaffirming to children, so that they don't have to go on like I did and went and was like, I'm going to show them, and became a lawyer, right? But that you feel comfortable in their identity as having a disability, and that there is no shame in a disability. And I think that that's the big thing, the big takeaway I hope that everyone can take from this presentation today, is that when we talk about disability pride, it's really about having that self-identity, that respect, and positive affirmation of disability in our daily lives.
Thank you for that. Okay, I don't see any questions, and I think John was helping me as we answered them. He clicked it. I was like, how does it know that the questions are getting answered? But I want to thank you, TJ, Marielle, and Anat for being here today. You You could be anywhere in the world and you chose to be with us. So thank you. We need this information. And I really, really appreciate it. I did want to do our little like shameless plug that we have something else coming up. And the date is on October 7th. We're going to do a webinar on supporting the Latinx community, and we're super excited. We're going to do one in Spanish and then one in English as well. And then on November 4th, we're going to do a community conversation on supporting the trans community. And much like this one, like a snapshot of some of the unique challenges, how we can be allies, how we can be supportive. So I just want to thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we ask that you help us to share this knowledge just in your regular conversations with folks, on your social media accounts, and feel free to share the link once you get it as widely as you can. And I just want to say thank you, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful afternoon and enjoys the last bits of summer, and to stay safe. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.